Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special conversation brought to you by Arab Center Washington, D.C. I'm Yousef Munayyer, head of the Palestine-Israel program here at the center, and I'm very glad to have two outstanding minds joining me in conversation today to analyze and assess the latest happenings after the United Nations General Assembly and the latest meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu. But before we get into that, let me introduce our guests. Noura Erakat is professor of Africana Studies and Criminal Justice at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, and she's the author of Justice for Some: Law and the Question of Palestine. She's also co-founding editor of Jadaliyya and an editorial board member of the Journal for Palestine Studies as well as Human Geography. In 2023, she co-chaired an independent task force on the application of National Security Memorandum 20 to Israel, a report documenting how U.S. arms to Israel have been used in violation of U.S. and international law, which was submitted to the White House. Daniel Levy is a political commentator and president of the U.S. Middle East Project. He previously served as MENA Director for the European Council on Foreign Relations and head of the Middle East Task Force at the Washington, D.C. New America Foundation. Daniel was a senior advisor in the Israeli Prime Minister's office and to Justice Minister Yossi Beilin during the government of Ehud Barak, and was a member of the official Israeli delegation during the peace talks at Taba under Barak and at Oslo B under Yitzhak Rabin. He's also briefed the UN Security Council on 4 occasions in the past 5 years, most recently in February of this year. So, Noura, Daniel, thank you so much for joining me. I should say that when we initially conceived of having this conversation, we wanted to respond to what we knew would be a UN General Assembly that was going to be focused heavily on Palestine, and also focused on announcements of recognition of a Palestinian state. We also knew that, of course, with all of these different leaders in town, here in the United States, in New York, in Washington, that there might be a lot more meetings, decisions, happenings. And yesterday we saw a meeting between President Trump and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that laid out what is being touted by the White House as a grand plan for peace and so much more, so much more. Let's maybe start there. And I want to just get a little bit of your initial reactions. I know you've both had a chance to observe what happened at the White House with the announcement, the plan that was put out, and of course the response from the Israeli Prime Minister as well. Let's maybe start with your initial reactions to what we saw. Noura, do you want to get us kicked off here?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Yousef. Thank you, Daniel. It's great to be with you both. I will say that in watching this, I was struck by a number of things. I'll just start at the most abstract level. The first and foremost is there is a conversation about the future of Palestinians without Palestinians there, which should strike all viewers as making that conversation illegitimate, and yet it's completely normalized, which reflects the dehumanization which we continue to struggle against and despite of. The second thing that I think was really, striking to me is the way in which Trump in his, first 35-minute, right, opening provided a narrative about the Palestinian, what becomes the Palestinian question after 1948, as such, the United Nations. His rendition of that narrative is one that reflects almost verbatim an Israeli narrative, and unfortunately would be indistinguishable were it a democratic administration that was touting it just the same. It was seeped in anti-Palestinian racism. It was seeped in a revisionist history. It described Israel as giving up primary coastline. The way in which that narrative was framed was to suggest that somehow Palestinians invaded a pre-existing state of Israel, which distorts the fundamental issue that we're dealing with, which is that Israel remains a settler colony on Palestinian land where a people are seeking and struggling for their right to self-determination. Besides that, into the specificity of it and looking at the 20-point plan together with, and I'm sure we're going to get into this more, but this really is the Gaza Riviera plan. With barely any modification. It really is the Gaza Riviera plan that in the terms of it, do not promise Palestinians self-determination at all. The language of it is that it is a possibility, but it remains contingent, that do not promise any guarantees that there will be full Israeli withdrawal. Instead, that they will withdraw to something, which folks should remember that in 1967, when Security Council Resolution 242 was drafted, that same ambiguity, right, when it's stipulated that Israel shall withdraw to territories occupied, that the lack of that definite article, the preceding occupied territories, is precisely what has enabled Israel to create this legal argument that it withdrew from the Sinai. And so therefore it could stay in the Golan Heights and in the West Bank and Gaza. And so here we're seeing a repetition of that kind of language, which places no stipulations on Israel and instead offers it a veneer of being able to stay. And finally, again, I'm trying to stay at an abstract level. The final thing is that it completely whitewashes genocide. This proposal, in the moment that it's presented, is meant to deflate all initiatives aimed at isolating Israel and the United States, of holding it to account, of breaking the siege, of prosecuting war criminals, of pursuing accountability at the ICC and the ICJ, and now wants to supplant it with a political process whereby the genocide never happened. Israel is rehabilitated. The only actors that will have any accountability are Hamas through their demilitarization, right? And the ceding of any self-determination in Gaza. And so this is horrifying. This is horrifying. And I think for me, what I'm still, sitting in shock with is the amount of support that it's received from a number of Arab states and even those who have been on the front line of accountability to end the genocide.
Yeah, and I want to get to that in a moment. And before I turn to Daniel, I want to say I picked up on something similar while I was watching Donald Trump go on and on and on. As you noted, with his sort of reiteration of this Israeli narrative, not just on the the entire history, but specifically in relation to Gaza and disengagement and all of that. And what was so interesting about watching it is that at this point, we've become quite familiar with Donald Trump and his antics and his delivery and the, ranting and raving and the obsession with himself and his grandeur and so on. But when he got to those points that he clearly wanted to make, or someone wanted him to make, he was reading from very, very clear text. And it was very obvious that this was part of the objective for the American president to reiterate an Israeli narrative of events at this press conference. If you notice, it's one of the few times he looks down and reads word for word what he is saying, because it's not his normal. Daniel, your initial reactions to all of this?
So first of all, it's good to be trying to unpack this with two people who I hugely respect and enjoy conversing with, Noura and yourself, Yousef. Let me come at it from a slightly different angle. And I guess my point of departure is both having been around the margins of the UN General Assembly the back half of last week, having kind of been exposed to the first iteration of this, what some of the initial reactions were. And then yesterday, when it kind of the splodge hit the world, kind of having read the press release, then read some other stuff, and only kind of on a late train home from Labour Party conference in Liverpool, having seen the press conference and seen the delivery, and that was the okay, now I really get it moment. But I totally hear what you're both saying. about landing those narrative lines. And yet, to me, and I obviously cannot claim representativeness as a viewer, but to me, it struck me that stuff was largely lost in what was a moment that was much more Monty Python South Park than anyone kind of taking serious. That was trying to capture at least 2 generations, but I could probably have given a third. Than to take a serious approach. So for me, the main takeaway is the unseriousness of all of this. And I'm going to suggest that makes it all a little less threatening, because I'm not saying, keep calm, it'll be okay. There's plenty to push back against here. But, look at where Russia-Ukraine is. And obviously that's very, all of these situations are serious, but the American intervention, the Trump plan impact on those things, I would argue is quite limited. And so I think it's right to deconstruct where these narratives are coming from, what it tells us in terms of an Israeli-American settler colonial framing. But I also think at the same time, the likelihood of this seeing the light of day in most respects is vanishingly slim. And I also think that there's, and again, we'll find out, maybe I'm being the cup half empty guy a little bit here, which I don't normally do. But my sense is that most of those who have become convinced, who have gone on a journey in this last period, in terms of their understanding of this situation, have been mobilized around Palestine in ways that the public was not in the past. To be frank, I've been listening to you guys and understanding this situation from a new angle. I don't think this has moved that public. In fact, it probably made them roll their eyes and become even more firm in the convictions that they have developed over this last period. And therefore, this stuff around how it was responded to, from the PA to the 8 Arab Muslim majority states who had met with Trump, to the Europeans who now think we all owe them something because they've recognized Palestine, I don't think that matters that much, because this is now set so firmly against a backdrop of, what do my people think about this? And I do take some succor from that. So what I would therefore say is, look, there are 3 components to this, okay? One is Gaza ceasefire, end of war, hostage return, IDF redeployment, etc. Secondly, there's a component of this as to how Gaza will be governed, invested in, made money from. I mean, we talk about war profiteering. This was a document of genocide profiteering. That's a horrific thing. So that's the second component. Third component, the throwaway stuff at the end about path to Palestinian statehood, political dialogue. I don't take the last 2 parts seriously, and therefore I want to look at that first component, and I think the answer is probably no. But I at least want to tease out, is there a prospect of doing a jiu-jitsu on Netanyahu here? Now, I think it's clear where Trump is, so I think it's very unlikely. I absolutely agree with what was said regarding the absence of Palestinians. I will say that I think not Palestinian public mobilization, civil society, but organized Palestinian politics a la PLO, PA, has earned its marginalization, and that is a fundamental factor here. But I also see partly the Arab state response, depending on how it's followed through, as being, we're not going to go head to head with Trump on this, but can we play this jiu-jitsu move? Now, as I say, I don't have a great deal of confidence in that. But there are things like the International Stabilization Force. I actually think it would be interesting to focus in on that and to get non-Israeli troops there to create actual safe zones. I don't, like I say, I don't want to appear Pollyannish, and I have as much criticism and an eyebrow raising and just jaw dropping shock as the paper at the paper and at what was said. But can this unintentionally create a path to making it more difficult for Israel to kill at will, to continue genocide, and to ethnically cleanse? Like I say, yesterday wasn't a great starting point, but there may be ways of playing this. And maybe I'll talk a bit about Netanyahu's domestic politics later in our conversation.
Yeah, I want to get to that, but I want to first just kind of wind it back a little bit and remind people about the context in which this is sort of taking place, not just the context on the ground in Gaza, which I think people are largely familiar with, but also what's happened over the last several weeks, both with international recognition, both with a number of European countries taking steps towards accountability in a lot of different ways. And of course, the many different statements that we saw by world leaders at the United Nations General Assembly. Um, I largely see this as Netanyahu's sort of retort to those who are still working for Palestinian self-determination. And he is saying, okay, the UN General Assembly might be your playground, but don't forget the White House, that's my playground. And this is how I get to reset the narrative globally about what's taking place. It's not us that is isolated, it's the Palestinians that are going to be pressed. It's the Palestinians that are going to have to answer to everyone around the world. And I'm going to organize this with my buddy Donald Trump from the Oval Office, and we're going to put on a nice show here with an offer that we know you have to refuse, type of thing. And that's the way that I see the sort of the optics of all of this. I agree with you, Daniel, that actually I don't think that's going to amount to much in the long term. I think at the end of the day that global publics are outraged over what's going on in Gaza, has been going on in Gaza, genocide now for 2 years. This is not going to change or stop that. But I also want to remind folks that, last week, Donald Trump was sitting down in a meeting with a number of different leaders from the region, from different Arab and Muslim countries. Everybody came out pretty positive about that. And this plan was supposedly discussed. And what we've learned, of course, since then is there are a number of things in the plan that seem to have changed after Netanyahu had a chance to sit down and chat with Trump. Another sort of theme in, U.S.-Israel quote unquote peacemaking, along with the absence of Palestinians and the ambiguity and all that replays itself time and time and time again. Netanyahu or the Israeli side gets the last shot at modifying these things. And we are already seeing differences in Netanyahu's interpretation of Trump's plan and the Arab interpretation of Trump's plan that's making it clear that this probably doesn't have the kind of amazing unified support that Donald Trump is claiming he's brought together on this. So I want to ask you all about, the United Nations General Assembly and these moves towards recognition. Noura, I want to just start with you, and obviously, if you want to take this elsewhere, respond to anything, please do. But on the recognition front, I think a lot of us would say too little, too late. And what's taking you so long to join the other 150 countries or so that have got to this point 30 years ago? But from an international sort of legal perspective, what doors open up in different countries through bilateral relations because there is an official recognition of a Palestinian state? Is that worth focusing on?
Yeah, I'll definitely answer your question, but I must respond to what was said. I want nothing more than to have faith in the optimism that you share, Daniel, and the skepticism that this is going to take root. I need to believe that, right? But unfortunately, empirically, I also know enough that from our precedent, how dangerous this is. In doing my own work and research, right, I read the PLO documents regarding the 1993 Declaration of Principles, which set up Oslo, right? Oslo on paper was a disaster. It was exactly what this outcome that we're living in now, some 30 years later, promised it to be. And when I did interviews with those people that were in the room, and they told me they did it on faith. They did it on faith because there was a Democratic administration. Clinton was coming in. He was going to deliver this state. When I read the PLO documents themselves, they used that language verbatim. They did it on faith. And yet, what we have as a result is that based on that faith, Israel has been able to, one, right, avoid reckoning completely, reckoning with Zionism, but even having, to reckon with itself. It's being saved. Two, it was able to frame all measures of accountability as counterproductive to peace and, as moving the goal, as hurting Palestinians, right? And three, it opened up opportunities for Israel to actually begin to normalize its economic relations with Arab states, which culminate in the Abraham Accords, which is why we're here where we're at today. So when I hear this idea that, yeah, well, this language and don't take it serious and da da da, I'm hearing on faith. And but
No, I'm not saying that at all, but I'll
no,
respond after.
I'm glad you're not, because I want to believe you, but that's what I'm hearing. And I'm really concerned that, this everybody has a different interpretation. But what will likely happen is that Trump will whip all these states into shape and say, look, we are stopping the bombardment. We are letting the humanitarian aid flow on condition that we get to control this process as led, by Trump and Blair in order to rebuild it, right? And that the ISF, there are other models for it in international law called a protection force, right? That would have accountability and has already been stipulated by the Hague Group as including the right to Palestinian self-determination. So my concern is we might get what we want in this immediate ceasefire, which is what everyone wants and primarily what Palestinians deserve. But what are the consequences of it afterwards when and I promise this to be true, there will be threats about pursuing accountability as undermining this, that there will be, definitely threats at the ICJ, and the ICJ is a political institution. It was able to take on that case by South Africa because of the groundswell. And if things shift and there's international momentum to resolve this politically rather than legally, right? We might see a decision that finds genocide in one instance, but, circumscribes it in order to help facilitate that political solution. I think this is really dangerous. That's why, I don't want to take it serious, but I think that it can have consequences that last longer. I'm happy to, if Daniel, you want to respond to that, and then I can get to the statehood. I'm going to answer your question, Yousef, but maybe
Yeah,
Daniel.
no, Daniel, why don't you go ahead briefly? But
Yeah.
I want to get to the statehood implication stuff, and I also, Daniel, want to ask you after that about the different European states and their positions in this moment.
Okay, yeah, and so to try and respond briefly, so I'm not optimistic. I'm giving the possibility here, and I'm also trying to suggest the following. I don't know if it's doable, but I am trying to suggest the following, because your framing, Yousef, was really, I think, spot on, which is you just had your UN playground, I've got my White House playground. Now, we have good reason to be not only deeply skeptical, but to see everyone as a sellout. But I would argue that that's what Netanyahu wants us to think, or that's what Netanyahu wants to portray, more importantly. So the president of Indonesia, in his speech at the UN General Assembly, said, if the Palestinians have their state, etc., we will have relations, and we're willing to put 20,000 troops on the ground. Netanyahu turned it on its head and said Indonesia is ready for normalization. Now, I don't want to suggest that Indonesia or anyone else is solidly doing the right thing, using their leverage. I'm not singling them out. You know, states much closer to home when it comes to Palestine. But what Netanyahu wants to try and create is that impression that they're with us, we're not isolated. And so I would say that in how we play on this, let's look at no, you're spinning this, Netanyahu. Actually, they're not with you. That response was a diplomatic response to a president that is largely out of control. And the things that they highlight in their response, the group of 8 states, and it's not the response I would have given, let me be very clear, but the things that they highlight are precisely the opposite of what Netanyahu highlights. Let's accentuate the differences. Let's all point at the things we want to point to in what they say.
Daniel, it's not just
Netanyahu wants us to point to.
It's not just that. It's not just that they highlight the differences. They're responding to a different version of the text that wasn't the text that ended up coming out, right? The Arab states are talking about a Palestinian state and a full Israeli withdrawal. Those things are not in the plan that ends up coming out of the the Netanyahu Trump meeting. And so, I get it. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to finish a thought. So not only that I wouldn't take any of this on faith, and I totally get, and you're absolutely right, Noura, in terms of how we got from Oslo to today. I think outside of a tiny cohort around certain leaderships, sadly, that in Ramallah, first and foremost, outside of that tiny cohort, no one is taking anything on faith. No one believes this. And therefore, perhaps wrongly, what I see is they're already trying to bash the ICC and the ICJ. They're already trying to whip everyone into shape. I don't think this represents a quantum step further in that respect. And what's more, and this is maybe my real optimism, I don't think people are buying it. I think the pressure is driven by a shift in the cultural zeitgeist that this is not going to put the brakes on. And therefore, I think things like the Hague Group are not going to fade into the distance. The accountability measures are not going to fade into the distance, perhaps also for one other, terribly sad but real thing, which is I don't think the Israelis are going to stop being not only criminal, but so cruel. I think the cruelty comes through so palpably, and this is not going to take Israeli society or politics out of its genocidal doom loop. And therefore, unfortunately, that's not going to change. And therefore, that zeitgeist shift is not going to change.
Yeah, and I think, Daniel, the reason I have trouble getting to the, I think all of us want to find hope, especially over the last 2 years. We want to believe that there's something positive that could come out of anything, given the horrors that we see on a daily basis. The trouble I have with even getting to the point of the international security force even existing is I just don't even if this starts going into motion, I don't see it going beyond the initial release of Israeli captives. And once that's over, there's zero incentive for the Israelis to stop doing what they're doing in Gaza. I don't think it gets to that, and I also find it hard to believe that the Israeli military would accept a situation where it has to, in some ways, coexist, cooperate in a space where there are international security forces in Gaza. I don't think they want that, and I think the reason that it's even on that paper is because they know it's never going to get to that. I want to focus in though on a different point, and Noura, I'm going to get you back in here in a second. I want to focus on this other point that both of you, I think, have made in one way or another, and which is true in this moment, and I think has been true historically, and that's that the international state system, the states, the major players, have failed Palestinians time and again. Whether it is the United Nations, the major players, and even the Arab states, the state system has failed to deliver for Palestinians. And to the extent that we see some sort of progress towards accountability or upholding the rights of Palestinians, it's not coming from state actors, right? It's coming from international organizations, it's coming in international legal forums, and it's coming from global civil society. And I want to focus on those things in this moment and get back to that legal question for Noura, but also there are tons of efforts across global civil society today responding to the genocide in Gaza, including a lot of brave folks making their way to Gaza right now by sea, and also people taking to the streets all over the world to press countries in Europe and elsewhere to change their position. So I want to refocus us a little bit on that because I think we are all in agreement that this Trump plan, whatever it is, however many points in it, however one wants to describe it, it's not going to move us in a good direction, and we're not going to expect that from the states that are involved. But what can we hope for? What can we see as possible in efforts of global civil society actors? And maybe Noura, I could toss it to you here.
Sure. I'm just going to wrap up that other conversation by saying I agree with every single thing that's been said. The only point of concern is the endorsement that the plan is getting from other states. That is where my concern is. Otherwise, I agree with everything and the skepticism, and it's dead in the water. But for the endorsement that it's received specifically at a moment when that plan was presented basically as an ultimatum, accept this or die, right? Which immediately makes it illegitimate and should have been countered as a contract under duress, which in the context that September 18th marked the General Assembly's own deadline to end Israel's unlawful presence in the West Bank and Gaza per the July, AO, the advisory opinion in the ICJ, that's where my concern is. But the place that I do have hope is that Israel continues to self-sabotage. And that's where I agree with you, Daniel. And I think that that's the thing that sadly will bear, we will bear the pain and the cruelty for, but that's where, this is probably not going to go anywhere precisely because of that. As to the global civil society, I think it's been the bright, the silver lining, so to speak, in the past 2 years. It's the fact that in unprecedented ways, for global civil society, Palestine has not only become an issue, but become the issue through which they're able to see the rest of the world, right? As Shireen Sayed said in one of her last talks, Palestine is paradigm, right? And others have picked this up. Palestine is paradigm. What I may have said, this is the epicenter of our global struggle. It could be the Trojan horse for everything. Folks understand that ending these conditions in Palestine is also the route to ending their own oppression that they deal with. And so, and that looks like, right, democracy, self-determination, an end of colonial extraction, right? The ability to be able to subvert capitalist logic and to place people back in the center of governing their future, and attachment to land, averting climate catastrophe. And so all of these things, that has been just so critical in how people have come to even understand themselves. And so because of that energy, that's precisely why we see, right, these ongoing cases under universal jurisdiction across Europe. It's the flotilla campaigns that we see. It's the ability to end, right? The PYM is able to avert the Maersk, and Elbit Systems, factories shutting down. It's why we see Microsoft actually ending part of its contract for surveillance with Israel. And here I just want to insist that before this, cruelest phase of Nakba, during this cruelest phase in Nakba, and after this phase, regardless of what comes, that's the energy that we have to maintain. Nothing gives us any indication that we take our foot off the gas on full boycott, divestment, and sanctions, our foot off the gas on accountability and chasing down war criminals and letting them know that they are not welcome, our foot off the gas on insisting on full Palestinian self-determination. And that's where our hope is, and that's actually the only thing that we have, and we're in a good place to continue it, notwithstanding, obviously, the efforts to criminalize precisely those movements, right? The designation of PAL action in the UK, or in the US, the designation of Sumud or Al-Haq or PCHR and Al-Mizan, right? That and what's coming down the pipe in terms of material support, that we have to keep our foot on the gas in that way.
I wanted to ask you, Daniel, following on Noura's points. We have seen, and you know, you're in Europe, you're watching this closely. Historically, Europe has always sort of followed Washington's lead when it comes to the so-called Middle East peace process. But now I think more than ever before, there is greater open disagreement, at least in stated policy, between Washington and a number of its European allies on the question of Palestine. You know, Donald Trump had this meeting with Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, recently, where he said, you know, you guys did the recognition thing, we don't agree with it, and they kind of agreed to disagree. That's not something that we've seen a lot in the past, and obviously it's something that is being driven by you know, the popular outrage over what people are seeing in Gaza. And this is a dynamic that I think is much more present in Europe than in the United States, but it's growing here in the US as well. How do you read shifting European positions on Palestine policy? And where do you see that going in terms of being able to create some actual change, given where Washington still is and doesn't seem to be ready to move away from yet?
Well, it really is the continuation of Noura's last points, isn't it? It's because I guess where I want to locate this, which may not be obvious, is this is not driven, other than a few very noteworthy, and they should be called out in a good way. Other than some exceptions, this is not being driven by governments seeking to do the right thing. So I think you do have exceptions. I think Spain, Slovenia, and Norway, in many respects, haven't done everything I would like them to do. But I'm certainly not going to spend my time criticizing them. And I think we also have to learn to hug the 80% good, the 65% good.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than seeing our friends sometimes as the people who haven't done enough. But when it comes to the UK, France, and many others, they are trying, and that's why it was easy to paper over the cracks with Donald Trump. And that's why they jumped out and welcomed this plan without the reservations that the 8 Arab and Muslim majority states, again, the changes they tried to make to the paper and the reservations wouldn't be the reservations I wrote. But it's a different response to France, UK, and others. And the fact that they kind of strutted up to the stage in New York and it was like, you all owe us now. We've recognized, so we're going to call some shots. But they weren't doing this because they have discovered that international law should apply to Palestinians, that they have discovered that there's something fundamentally flawed in a project of ethno-supremacy that they have allied with. That's not why they've done this. They have done this because they think it's the minimum that they can get away with in the face of their own domestic politics. That certainly applies to the UK. So let me tell you what happened on Monday, September 29th, at the party conference of the ruling Labour Party here in the UK. There was a motion, a very soft motion, that basically welcomed the recognition of Palestinian statehood, put to conference by the Labour Party leadership. And there was a motion put by other party members, which said we need to acknowledge genocide and we need sanctions. And those sanctions need to be far-reaching, and it included arms and other trade. The Labour Party leadership did everything to defeat that motion. The people who proposed the motion weren't allowed to speak. Now, remember, this is a Labour Party largely purged of the left, of its progressive flank, of pro-Palestinians. And the motion to acknowledge genocide and to sanction was overwhelmingly passed by a conference of a Labour Party now created in the image of its current leadership, because that tells you where the centre of gravity, not just in the Labour Party, I would argue, but in public opinion in so much of Europe is. And therefore, I do think you're right to suggest that one of the things Netanyahu was trying to do was to take a reset on, it's not our fault, it's their fault. Stop with the isolation, stop with all of that. When he talked about isolation and autarky and super Sparta, it was one of the few moments where he kind of lost his footing in the public narrative in Israel. There was pushback. People said, hey, guy, that's not what we're signing up for. We thought we were killing Palestinians and it was all okay. We didn't think that it would really lead to those things. Why are you acknowledging them? So I think what you see going on in Europe is, yes, governments are hugging this, hoping that their domestic political problem will go away. And for all the reasons that we've all said, I don't think it will go away. So look, the Samud flotilla, right? An act of just remarkable and huge courage that people have taken. Now, one can look at it and say, Spain, Italy, Turkey, they're not really going to intervene. Perhaps in a few hours, perhaps by the time this conversation is listened to by people, we'll know where this ends up. They're not really going to intervene. But the fact that they felt that the move that their public wanted to see them make was to do something, to send ships along, that was inconceivable just a few months ago, right? So things are moving. This may be an attempt to reverse that. I don't think it will be successful. And I think, and Noura and myself have both referenced something called the Hague Group. I won't go into it now, but I encourage people to look it up, look up Noura's speech the other night, look up the Hague Group meeting the other day. And I think the Hague Group, which has said, we will adhere to the rulings of the international justice system. We will not be accountable. We will not be complicit. We will hold Israel accountable. They have planted a flag in what feels often like the quicksand of eroding international norms. They have planted a flag, and I think they're helping to pull the gravitational direction of things into that accountability. And that's why the horror show of yesterday, I may be horribly wrong, the horror show of Trump Netanyahu may end up looking more like a blip than a defining moment.
I think you're probably right about that, Daniel. It'll probably be more of a blip than a defining moment, but I think it's going to be typical of a lot of efforts that we're going to see moving forward to try to hold together as much as possible Israel's reputation, particularly among Western audiences, because, and I'm glad you brought up the Sparta speech that Netanyahu made, because it was really kind of a remarkable moment where he was acknowledging the degree of isolation that is facing Israel, which is only going to grow. But there, I think, is probably a hope on the Israeli side that there's a way to kind of avert that there is a post-genocide reality, if we ever get to that they can put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That they can go back to a place where the obvious contradictions between Zionism and human rights and democracy are not clear to everybody, and that the rising tide of global outrage will recede. I want to
look. I mean, can I say one sentence on this, if I can, Yousef? And look, if you said place your bet, I'm not saying that won't happen, because Noura has correctly said.
This is the question that I want to ask. This is the question that I want to ask both of you. We don't have to necessarily place bets, but to close out here, and I really do appreciate you both joining to kind of break all of this down. As we look forward, Noura, you talked about the efforts that we are seeing now to repress dissent all over the place, including here in the United States. The efforts that are aiming to tear down the very international institutions which defined the post-World War II order, if it means holding Israel accountable for genocide. This fight is going to go on for a long time. How do you see it playing out? I'll leave this as the question for both of you before we close. How do you see it playing out? And is there hope for those on the Israeli side who think that things can go back to the way that they were, that there is a path back for Israel?
Really quickly on recognition, the benefits of recognition Palestinians have already enjoyed, because they were recognized by a majority of General Assembly states in 2012, which basically established the status of Palestine as a non-member state of the United Nations, because the membership is controlled by the Security Council, where the US was opposed to it, but they are a state, that's their status. That gave them all the advantages they already could have had from recognition, including acceding to the Rome Statute, which has given them the jurisdiction to enter into, and to pursue the ICC, accountability at the ICC, and, also what's given them the ability to appear in these other bodies. Now, what we get in terms of these additional late coming states, not very much in terms of law, but what can be hoped for is in terms of political momentum. And what the risk is that in appeasing their rebellious peoples who have demanded more of their governments, that they use this as a way to basically absolve themselves of complicity and ongoing genocide and their outstanding legal obligations to prevent genocide and to end Israel's unlawful presence and to dismantle apartheid.
Look, like I was starting to say, I don't dismiss at all that there are sources of hope for those who would say, just get this in the rear view mirror and we can go back to Israel being, the reputational product that we could market so easily, and Zionism's foundational flaws will be forgotten and people won't be talking that whole language, etc. Israel is, I think, premising that possibility on a couple of things. Primarily, it would seem that the overwhelming use of unmatched military power will simply make everyone cower. Mm-hmm. And if you can get the region to cower because you've bombed, you've violated the sovereignty of 6 states, plus everything you're doing in Palestine against Palestinians. If you can do that, then they may not like it. They may see you as a national security threat. They may see you as a radicalizing, destabilizing, the most radicalizing, destabilizing component in the region. But if they haven't got a military answer to contain and deter you, they will eventually come under the wing of Pax Israel Americana. And that's the bet Netanyahu is placing. And I don't want to say that it's a bet that is destined to fail. I think it's overreach. I think it's high risk. I think it's high stakes. The other thing he's saying is we are still a tech superpower and a financial superpower, not only in this whole startup nation nonsense, but also because of the influence we have with others. And you saw Netanyahu say it on the weekend. We bought TikTok. Our friends bought TikTok. That one's done now. That's the bet that they are placing. The counter bet is they have been exposed. This is not going to go away. You are not a power that can anymore be simply ignored by the rest of the region. Because whether it's the way they're dismissing Egyptian national interests or Jordanian interests, Turkey knows they're coming for them next. Look what they have done in the Gulf. So I think I'm not saying they now have a strategy, but everywhere people are asking themselves that question. And so my read is there are 2 tracks here. Both tracks don't necessarily look hopeful in the short term. And those 2 tracks are, number one, the track of Israeli destruction versus the track of Israel being perceived differently and the mobilization of pressure towards accountability, whether it's Eurovision, whether it's being kicked, it's a European Song Contest, whether it's being kicked out of international football, where Israel plays in Europe. These things are moving slower than the trail of destruction, but they are moving, and I think they're moving irreversibly. The second track is that we have the Americans with us, perhaps more than ever under this administration, and no one can stop us. And that track is again moving alongside another track, which is geopolitics is shifting. This is not a unipolar world. That's part of the story of the Hague Group. And the way that Trump acts, he sent Modi to Putin and Xi. Things are shifting, and the region sees things are shifting. So if you ask me, those things are going to catch up and blow back in the face of that project. Not fast enough for now.
Yeah, and things are shifting in the United States as well.
Absolutely.
Noura, we'll throw it to you to finish us off here.
Well, I thought that that was a very thorough answer. And, you know, the one thing I would emphasize is that all of this is contingency. All of this depends on what is yet to be done and will be done and how we continue to respond. There is nothing, you know, had the genocide continued without accountability, I think it would have been much more clear that, you know, that's it. That's it. Israel is, you know, burying itself and has isolated itself. There's no way to resurrect it. And in fact, I think that it truly has lost the legitimacy, you know, the legitimacy argument, that it can no longer make the argument that Zionism is a movement for the self-determination of a people in order to, you know, respond to racial exclusion that resulted in genocide, right? Which is how Zionism has been sold. Now that moral argument has dropped out the bottom, and what you get now instead is that might makes right. And we will bully you, and we will coerce you, and we will punish you, and we will dox you if you disagree. And so in that sense, I think insofar as that remains clear, that's it, Israel has forever isolated itself and lost that moral argument. What is the contingency then? Is what states do in this moment, and that's the major risk, that in their pursuit of trying to, you know, contain Palestinians yet again, and here I want to emphasize that we wouldn't be here if people identified properly that the problem were the systems of oppression, like prolonged military occupation, apartheid, genocide, right? And instead have made Palestinians into the problem. So rather than destroy these systems, they're attempting to destroy Palestinians, which is how this is continuing. And I fear that if states just move forward and basically, you know, Palestinians are sacrificed down the river in order to get these security pacts, in order to make sure that there's some sort of stability in the region that protects them from American aggression and Israeli aggression that's completely unchecked, right? That they'll want to clamp down on their civil society and to change this narrative and to rehabilitate Israel yet again. Right. And I just want to end with what Trump said when he said, people said that when I recognized, you know, the Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, that nothing would happen. Everything happened, including the murder of some 218 protesters during that time between May and October in 2018, and now culminating in genocide. That's what happened. And so the risk here is that this attempt to constantly try to rehabilitate Israel and ethno-nationalism and a racially supremacist ideology is that much worse is likely to happen. And so I agree just on the overall that there are things that have been set in motion, but that it remains contingent based on what states remain to be done. And I would encourage everybody out there to continue organizing, and especially those who are scholars, to continue, you know, producing an archive, to continue insisting that this is genocide, that future generations, when we are long gone, if there are books that survive, will, you know, be able to look back and understand this moment for what it was, that this was a colonial genocide waged by the only nuclear power in the Middle East and backed by global superpower.
Well, thank you for that, Noura. We'll leave it there for this conversation. Noura, Daniel, thank you so much for joining me to break all of this down in this special conversation, and for everybody who tunes into all of this. We hope you'll continue to follow the work of the Arab Center, and you could find plenty more information at arabcenterdc.org, including about upcoming events like our annual conference, which is titled Trump and the Middle East, a second term review, on Thursday, October 16th. Thank you both again, and have a good one.